Uno.
Buenos días de nuevo, estimadas y estimados colegas. Es un placer para mí estar otra vez aquí con ustedes, esta vez para presentar a nuestro estimado Mark Ginsburg, profesor de la Universidad de Maryland, profesor recientemente jubilado de la Universidad de Maryland, un experto en educación comparada internacional, autor de varios textos famosos y conceptualizaciones sobre la reforma educativa. Es la conferencia final. Y le agradezco mucho a Mark su presencia y también a Paola Virginia Suárez Ávila del Centro de Estudios México-Estados Unidos de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, quien tendrá a cargo la moderación y la traducción de la conferencia de Mark. Les pido que vayan apuntando, vayan tomando nota para que vía el chat le hagan preguntas a Mark. Y con esto le cedo la palabra a Paola para que se haga cargo de todo y yo pueda quitarme el saco porque yo estoy en Mexicali. Estamos transmitiendo desde la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras. Yo estoy en Mexicali, afuera hace un calor muy fuerte, pero aquí adentro el aire acondicionado es...
So, hi everybody, welcome to this panel and conference to close the 5th meeting of International and Comparative Education, organized by the Faculty of Philosophy of National University of Mexico, UABC, and UAM Unidad Metropolitana de Xochimilco. I'm so glad to present to you Mark Ginsburg, our distinguished guest for today from the University of Maryland College Park for his conference and also his dissertation. I'm so glad also to introduce the name of the title of his conference, that it's Economic and Media War Against Socialist Societies, the Case of US and Cuban Relations. So in this occasion, we have more than 30 or 40 minutes to the conference of our guests. And also we have time to discuss at the end the conference with Mark. So I sent to you the invitation to send us the questions at the end of our presentations. So I give comments, just a briefly comment to introduce and finish and conclude the conference of Mark. So thank you so much, Mark. I'm really glad. I am also glad to see your photograph of Cuba and all these manifestations. So it's really wonderful work that you're going to present to us this day. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate your participation.
Perdóname, Paola.
Adelante, sí.
Creo que es al revés, debes hablar en español. Él va a hablar en
ok. Bueno, agradezco muchísimo la invitación, sobre todo a Carlos, a Zaira por esta invitación para moderar la mesa. Estamos presentando actualmente a la conferencia de clausura del 5º Encuentro de Educación Internacional y Comparada, organizada por la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de nuestra universidad, la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. En esta ocasión, así como de la UABC y la Sociedad Mexicana de Educación Comparada. En esta ocasión, me dará muchísimo gusto presentar a Mark Ginsburg, quien es profesor investigador de la Universidad de Maryland College Park, quien nos dará una conferencia muy interesante que yo he tenido la oportunidad de revisar, y al final yo daré mis comentarios sobre las relaciones principalmente de los Estados Unidos y Cuba, vistos a través de un análisis económico y sobre la guerra mediática que existe actualmente entre los Estados Unidos. Yo podría hacer un comentario previo que, a la lectura previa de esta conferencia. Ha sido muy interesante la actualización de los datos que da Mark en cuanto a la relación entre Estados Unidos y Cuba, que es sin duda una relación muy importante para comprender en México. Y bueno, yo les agradezco a todos también su presencia, que estén aquí en este foro, en este cierre de clausura. Estaríamos en Mexicali, como dice Carlos, con aire acondicionado, pero estamos pues en distintos lugares, entonces también agradecerles a todos ustedes su participación de modo virtual en este cierre de la conferencia. Pues sin más, estaremos presentando la conferencia en inglés. El doctor Mark Ginsburg estaría presentando la conferencia en inglés. Estaremos pasando la presentación en español. Al final, las dudas y las preguntas que se puedan tener del público serán en español. Yo las podré traducir, así como los comentarios que dé Mark, y yo haré también un cierre de conclusiones previo a las preguntas. Entonces, agradezco mucho a ustedes su participación y bueno, y su entusiasta, sobre todo su entusiasta lectura activa de esta ponencia de Mark. Y una vez más, pues bienvenido, Mark, a nuestro quinto encuentro, y bueno, me da muchísimo gusto también tener aquí presentes a los organizadores. We can start. So
Sí,
welcome,
sí.
Mark.
Sí, gracias Paula y Carlos y muy buenos días a Marco y todos los otros en esta sesión. I'll speak in Spanish, in English, sorry, and let the translators do their important work. But the PowerPoint has been translated, so when that's displayed, you'll be able to follow some of it in Spanish, but the translation will also help, I hope. I'm speaking to you from the Awawas land that was taken over by colonists and eventually became part of Mexican territory. It's currently called Santa Cruz, California. But in my background is actually a photo recently taken when I was at the May Day celebration in Havana. And some of you who have had the opportunity to travel to Cuba will recognize the Plaza de la Revolución. I guess we can put the first PowerPoint slide up.
Excuse me, Mark. Excuse me, Mark. Let's give Paola the opportunity to translate this part into Spanish, your introduction.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, pues Mark les da la más cordial bienvenida también a esta conferencia, y el trabajo que va a presentar pues tiene que ver mucho con la relación y sobre todo los trabajos que ha realizado en la Universidad también de Santa Cruz en California, pero también la oportunidad que ha tenido de viajar y estar presente en Cuba. Él hace una muy buena referencia a todos nosotros sobre esta plaza, una plaza simbólica que es la Plaza de la Revolución, como ustedes la pueden ver, está en el fondo de su pantalla. Y bueno, pues es una manera de iniciar, ¿no? esta plática para que todos nosotros podamos reconocer en primera el espacio de Cuba, ¿no? Yo creo que esto va a ser fundamental para nosotros, y en segunda, pues para que él también sienta el espacio conforme a la exposición que va a hacer a continuación. Entonces, Mark, con esta presentación vamos a trabajar, como les he mencionado, la presentación en español. Entonces, varios de los comentarios están aquí, ya resumidos, los principales de la conferencia para todos ustedes. Y bueno, pues en el caso de que haya alguna duda, yo también podría resolverlo en el momento. Muchísimas gracias, Mark.
Doctora, ¿puede hacerlo en presentación?
Sí,
Okay.
ya lo hago en presentación. Un momento.
So this presentation is based really on a review of literature, both in academic outlets, journals, and books, but also in more general media that has published work about this topic. The focus is on economic and media war against socialist societies, although really focused on the case of U.S.-Cuban relations. I frame this as economic and media war because, in fact, it is a form of violence that has been perpetrated by the U.S. government and not only by the government, as I'll talk, by various media outlets. It's violence that is, I think, structural and indirect. It's not, using weapons of mass destruction or other kinds of weapons, although that has been a part of the history of U.S.-Cuban relations, but its efforts to create or perpetuate illiteracy, poverty, ill health, shortened lifespan, and environmental degradation, which some of my colleagues in the area of peace education have distinguished as macro level forms, but this is international macro level. I focus on economic warfare, particularly the use of sanctions and unilateral coercive measures that have a long history in Cuba, and I'll talk about that. But I also focus on what I call the media war, and really three different types. The war that of disinformation and efforts to criticize Cuba from U.S. owned and managed media. Talk about that, the radio and TV Marti in particular. The role of so-called independent corporate media, which has played an important role over the years. And more recently, the role of social media, and give particular attention to the way in which social media has been utilized in sometimes effectively, but other times not so effectively, to promote discord and even people in the streets in Cuba. I think it's important to say that this effort to bring about regime change in Cuba started very soon after the triumph of the revolution in 1959. Bolander argues that the earliest days of Fidel's victory, America has obsessed over this relatively insignificant third world country, determined to eliminate the radically different social and economic order instituted by the revolution. But I also think it's important to note that U.S.-Cuban relations have a much longer history, and efforts to control what goes on in Cuba certainly didn't start in 1959. I make reference in this paper that I've written to the person who eventually became one of the presidents of the U.S., but at the time was just working for the administration, the U.S. administration, John Quincy Adams, who some people argue was the intellectual author of the Monroe Doctrine. And he wrote that in 1823, he wrote that the annexation of Cuba to our federal republic, meaning to the US Republic, will be indispensable to the continuance and integrity of the Union itself. And he used the metaphor of an apple falling from the tree to say that it wasn't possible right now, interesting, because of Great Britain rather than Spain, which was the colonial master of Cuba at the time. But eventually, by the laws of political gravity, Cuba would fall into the realm of the U.S. And of course, in 1898, when Cuba was about to succeed in its independence struggle from Spain, the U.S. intervened, and the story goes on from there. Let me move next slide to what I call the economic war, and I'm not the only one who uses this expression. This cartoon I really like because it shows the relative size of the United Nations, the little boat to the left, and the U.S. Giant with arms surrounding Cuba. And as we'll talk, the UN has criticized and condemned the U.S. actions, the blockade or embargo, but with so far limited impact. Next slide. The contemporary policies toward Cuba were articulated very soon after the revolution. There's a State Department memo by a man named Lester Mallory, which in 1960 proposed that every possible means should be undertaken to weaken the economic life of Cuba by denying money and supplies to Cuba in order to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. I must admit that personally, these and other statements and actions are an embarrassment to me coming out of our government that is alleged to be a promoter of human rights. This memo became instantiated, put into practice, if you will, by President Kennedy. The memo was actually written under a previous administration of Eisenhower, but Kennedy put it into place in 1962, and even more so in 1963. And this was stated as a prohibition of trade, travel, and financial relations unless they were licensed by the Treasury Department. In a sense, the U.S. blockade has attempted to prevent Cuba from establishing normal economic relations with a whole range of countries. And as I think everybody knows, in some ways, for a number of years, this had less of an impact because of Eastern European and the Soviet Union's relations with Cuba provided some trading partners. But after '89 and particularly after '91, this option was no longer available, and the blockade has continued. What for me is even more heart-wrenching is the fact that the blockade and the efforts of this economic war are strengthened at, if you will, the worst times they could possibly happen, when Cuba is dealing with very severe economic and social crises. So, for example, although the executive orders that I mentioned by Kennedy, and in some ways reinforced by subsequent administrations, there are also laws that were passed, but the laws were passed in the 1990s, early 1990s, just after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Cuba's trade relations were dramatically reduced as a function of that. The Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, the Helms-Burton so-called Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996, and one just at the end of the special period that Cuba was experienced because of the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's now, since that time, become something that only the U.S. Congress can reverse. There are limited actions that administrations can take to reverse this. And during the Trump administration, in the midst of the pandemic, the blockade was dramatically strengthened by, if you can imagine, 243 executive actions by the Trump administration. I have to admit that the people advising Trump, maybe more so than him himself, were quite creative in finding every little way they could to strengthen the embargo. And up until very, very recently, the Biden administration has continued to promote the blockade. Just a little bit over a week ago, Biden took the first move, or at least optimistically the first move, took a move to reverse a few of the 243 sanctions that Trump put in place to allow remittances, although the organizations and companies that provide that are still on the restricted list, so it's not clear how much that will help. Some expansion of the cities that US-based airlines can travel to, and a promise, along with a long list of historical promises, to increase the number of visas that are available. As some of you know, if Cubans want to travel to the US, they haven't in recent years been able to go to the US consular section in Havana. They had to travel to a third country. This now allows for a few visas to be issued directly at the embassy. And we'll see how much this really opens up. Let's move to the next slide. The policy has, as I mentioned, been condemned 29 times by the UN General Assembly. In part, it's condemned because it violates the sovereignty of Cuba. And of course, according to international law, this is a violation. But it's also condemned because the US has worked to extend the blockade extraterritorially, that is, to involve other countries besides Cuba and the US. So Canadian banks, or even companies that produce pajamas, are limited in their interactions with with Cuba for fear of being fined by the U.S. government. European banks similarly. So it makes Cuba not only search around for trading partners, but the financing is really a major challenge. Because U.S. is a democracy, so-called, you might be surprised that the vast majority, a large majority of U.S. citizens want to end the blockade and to normalize relations. And even more surprising, given the rhetoric of both the Democratic and Republican Party nominees in recent years, the majority of Cuban Americans want to move toward normal relations. So somehow these policies continue despite what might be seen as a strong voice among citizens for a change. This is not just a symbolic blockade. It has real impact. It has impact in terms of the daily lives of people in Cuba, and also to people like myself who would like to freely travel to Cuba. It's very challenging at times, and there were periods when it was illegal for almost any American to travel to Cuba or to have an academic or educational exchange. And certainly the fundamental rights to sufficient food, the UN Special Rapporteur mentioned, has an impact on education, has an impact even on healthcare, one of the real accomplishments of the revolution, because importing some of the basic medicines, let alone the ingredients for the various COVID antivirus vaccines that Cuba has developed, has been a challenge because of this. So it affects basic human rights in Cuba, while at the same time the US administration has often argued that the sanctions need to be in place because of what are alleged to be human rights violations in Cuba. Moreover, the US has tried to sanction Cuba for sending doctors around the world, and certainly has tried to describe them as people being trafficked, involved in human trafficking, that they are somehow slaves being forced to provide medical care around the world, including during the pandemic. So we can see that in some ways the impact on Cuba has been severe. The amount of damages that the Minister of Foreign Relations mentioned in one of his talks in 2021 of almost $148 billion over the 6 decades. But thus far, the ultimate goal of changing Cuba's government and political economic system has not been accomplished. But let's move to the next slide, because it hasn't only been through the blockade and the unilateral coercive measures. Cuba has been the focus of what I call a media war, via propaganda that is transmitted through different kinds of mass media, but also through social media. this photo that's on this slide is actually from a really powerful museum in a way. The memorial of denunciation that has opened up in Cuba in the last year or so, that is dedicated to telling the story of how U.S. policy has targeted Cuba, and there's a whole section on the media war, and this is a photo from one of the displays there. As I said, it's a media war, but there are different kinds of media. Some of the media are actually organs of the United States, basically funded and managed, although subcontracted out, as much of U.S. activity is in recent decades. It's also involves the so-called independent, what I would call corporate mass media, and then the social media that we'll talk about. In terms of U.S. funded media, most people are probably familiar with the next slide, please, with the radio and TV Marti, which were established relatively recently. The first effort at using U.S.-owned media to influence events in Cuba and to try to shape popular opinion and encourage either rebellion or joining with mercenary forces goes back to 1960. The so-called Radio Free Cuba, or Radio Swan, which was the island off the coast of Honduras where it was being transmitted. This was an effort about a year before the Bay of Pigs that was put into place in a way as an initiative in order to try to encourage people to join with the mercenaries that invaded on the Bay of Pigs in 1961. So they were building up to this and made use of that. But TV Marti and Radio Marti are perhaps better known, but these come, some years after the triumph of the revolution. Radio Marti began transmitting in May of 1985, and TV Marti is even more recent, although more than 30 years of existence, basically transmitting messages and programs, providing the U.S. perspective, of the U.S. government's official perspective on what's going on in Cuba, and trying to encourage people to resist or revolt against the Cuban government. It's not the only effort by the U.S. to do that. Some people will know about Radio Free Europe, which was developed at the time that there were so-called socialist regimes in Eastern Europe. But this has gone on for many years at a relatively significant expense. I mean, it's a small portion of the U.S. budget, which is devoted quite a bit to other kinds of warfare, but 28 million is used annually, according to one estimate. But what research has been done, and not only research by other organizations, but also by the U.S. government, has shown that it has a very limited impact. Perhaps less than 1% of the Cuban population report that they even had access to it. Cuba has been fairly effective in blocking it, but my conversations with Cuban colleagues say that even if they know it's available, they probably wouldn't want to tune in because they know the source and they know the purpose of such broadcasts. Some would argue that the most important group of beneficiaries to this effort by through radio and TV Marti is a group of anti-revolution, anti-Cuban government people living in Florida who have received funding to develop and to implement these stations and these programs. Interestingly, I don't have evidence of it, but I suspect some of that money flows back to candidates who are willing to speak out against Cuba and in their campaigns when they're running for office. The cartoon up at the right-hand corner makes reference to the fact that both radio and TV Marti make use of the name of Jose Marti, who's one of the important heroes who spent some time in the U.S., but and a variety of other countries, including Mexico. But at least as Fidel Castro Ruz had said at one point, it's really obnoxious that the U.S. would appropriate Marti's name to try to end what at least he and many Cubans I've spoken to think is part of an ongoing effort that was stimulated initially by Marti and even earlier than Marti. Next slide. So, in addition to these U.S. organs, if you will, they're subcontracted out, but they're basically fully funded operations of the U.S. government, the way I frame them. There are some very, very powerful analyses of the way that the so-called independent corporate mass media, both television and newspapers, has joined in the chorus, seemingly providing the refrains to the U.S. government statements about Cuba, and for the most part providing a rather biased reporting on what's going on in Cuba, and also including things that for which there's no evidence, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Whitney, for example, argues that the U.S. government pays big money for bad news about Cuba, and Bolander, in a very important book, talks about how media enthusiastically endorses the U.S. government's counter-revolutionary objectives to end Cuba's socialist experiment. He also goes on to talk about not just the conservative outlets like Washington Times and Fox News, but the so-called liberal media like the New York Times and Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, seem to present almost the same kind of message. Exceptions can be noted, but the overall message is pretty clear. But this isn't only since the 1959 revolution. There's fascinating discussion by Bolander about the way in which newspapers in the late 1890s, the late 19th century, were actively presenting a picture of Cuba as helpless and naive and needing the rescue of the U.S. Not coincidentally, this is part of an effort that eventually led the U.S. to intervene to save Cuba from the continuance of the Spanish colonial power. And then, in a way, Cuba for a number of years became a neo-colonial region for the U.S. Interestingly, at the same time that Cuba was put into the orbit of the United States, Puerto Rico, which continues in a even more ambiguous relation with the U.S. and the Philippines were also part of that that historical process. More recently, there was a kind of broadcasting about a so-called Havana Syndrome. Very little evidence ever was presented, at least publicly, of the people who were affected by it. But both Canada and the US claimed that some of their diplomats who were stationed in Havana had experienced severe medical problems as a result of so-called sonic attacks. Cuba investigated it. A number of other independent researchers tried to identify what it is. There was a big debate about it, but recently, the CIA released a report that said they have no evidence that it was organized by any government, and specifically not by the Cuban government, but it still had an impact. The press helped to kind of mobilize public opinion, and at that point in 2017, the U.S. administration under Trump basically downgraded U.S.-Cuban diplomatic relations, reducing the number of people in the embassy and consulate in Havana, and forcing the Cubans to do the same in Washington, D.C., among other actions that the Trump administration took, given the so-called sonic attacks. And again, one could hope that, besides what the U.S. government would say, that independent journalists and independent media would do a more thorough investigation, but in some ways relied on U.S. statements as if they were documented, even though the statements rarely had any such documentation. So again, an example of the way corporate media has been used, or was used to echo and reinforce the anti-Cuban government orientation of the U.S. government. Before going to the next slide, I assume you might appreciate the cartoon, which is pointing to a framed US dollar on the wall, and the individual seated with the striped shirt pointing to it, saying, "This is my degree or title of an independent journalist," somewhat tongue-in-cheek view of the way in which US dollars have been used to shape the so-called independent media. Let's move to the next slide, where I pick up the question of social media. These efforts have really been ramped up in the last 2 or 3 years. But as you'll see, it isn't just around the events of that I'll speak in more detail about in 2021 that U.S. efforts to create social media platforms and to use them to disseminate ideas that would discourage people from supporting or even encourage people to rebel or resist, protest, and even try to bring about a change in the Cuban government. The Twitter-like platform that was created by the U.S. government with U.S. government funding through the National Endowment for Democracy, goes back to 2010. I don't have any indication that there were efforts before that, but it could be that just hasn't been researched and I wasn't able to get access to it. But this was initially a very successful effort. It attracted sizable numbers of Cubans, who, like people all over in most parts of the world, are, if not addicted, at least actively connected to social media. And this effort was part of a strategy of promoting ideas in Cuba that would lead to changes. As MacLeod argues, the U.S. government plan was to first capture the Cuban market and gain the trust of the people, the Cuban people, then to slowly drip feed to give ideas to users, anti-communist messages, making it appear as if there was a groundswell of resentment, in a sense, using social media to kind of amplify and repeat the messages. And then MacLeod goes on to say that one day users would be alerted that a huge protest was happening and that they should participate or attend. And we'll see that in 2021, this actually comes to fruition on July 11th. It's important to say that this was not designed to affect the Cuban population more generally, in part because social media is consumed more often by youth, and but it was also targeted specifically at hip hop artists and others who were, if you will, part of a cultural groups that were not particularly happy with the current government. So there was an effort to kind of reinforce their voice and also to instigate their actions. This was done with U.S. funding. There are projects that one can identify from USAID as early as 2009. Again, being contracted out to a group that I know a little bit about because I worked in the NGO world in Washington, a group called Creative Associates. And they worked, for the most part, under the radar, certainly not announcing where their funding came from or that it was a US project, but they attempted nonetheless to promote ideas, anti-government and anti-revolution ideas among the population in Cuba, at least those who were connected to social media. Let me give a couple of examples of when this happened. Next slide, please. On July 11th of 2021, there were definitely protest actions that took place in Cuba. One can see in the photos from that day, some of the people who participated and also some of the destruction that took place. These were alleged to be peaceful demonstrations. They were in some places peaceful and other places quite unpeaceful or violent during that time. This is from reports by the Cuban government, but also by others who were in Cuba at the time for, other purposes, attending meetings or traveling as part of exchanges. And these are the most significant anti-Cuban government public protests that took place since the 1990s. And again, the efforts to promote participation during the 1990s was somewhat easier because, in fact, the economic crisis that Cuba was experiencing. Similarly, during this time, in 2011, Cubans were unquestionably suffering. The pandemic is a major part of that. The continued and strengthened blockade is part of that. People weren't getting access to as much food or medicine as they wanted. And so some people participate in this because they were not happy with the current economic situation. And so I think that has to be said. This wasn't just a set of actions promoted by the US government, but in some ways it was catapulted by the US government, because in many ways the messages that got put particularly on social media and sometimes in the demonstrations or protest actions was about changing the government. They were anti-government or anti-communist, as you can see in the photo. But the protests were definitely promoted via social media. While, as I said, some people joined the protests because they had very legitimate economic and health-related concerns during this time. What to me is another indication that I'm a person of a previous millennium or generation is the way in which bots and algorithms and other things were used on social media to multiply the messages that went out. And it's pretty well documented that a lot of the messages were actually sent either from Miami or from Spain, where there are a number of activists who are hoping to promote regime change in Cuba. And some of this was funded by the US, some of it I think may have been, independent kinds of actions. I do have one personal account that I'll add at this point. As I mentioned, I recently traveled to Cuba. I was there for May Day and parade, and the day before I was at a block party in a small city, a small town in the province of Artemisa, which is located just to the east of the capital of Havana. And I had a chance to talk with some young adults, I'd say, late teens, early 20s. During this block party, we went off to a place that was a little bit quieter because the music was quite loud. But I confirmed what I suspected, is that they were very active with social media. And so I asked them whether they had seen any messages prior to July 11. And they confirmed that they did. And they said they were really angered by the fact that what they suspected was messages coming from particular groups, and some of them may be funded by the US. But even more important than that for me is the fact that they said what it did for us was motivate us to organize a small demonstration in our town in support of the government, or as they said, in support of the revolution. And there were definitely other actions like that around the country. Some people view this as only happening because President Diaz-Canel recommended that supporters of the revolution go to the street. But these youth, at least, planned their protests before the protests actually took place in various cities around the country, and before Miguel Diaz-Canel came out and said he hoped that supporters of the revolution would also take to the streets and show their support. Next slide, please. This is a photo which was not easily accessible in the US, certainly not promoted through mass media or on social media. But it was much bigger part of what happened on July 11th, and that is people who supported the government and the revolution coming out to rally in and to speak to show their support. This could have been presented through the mass media, could have been circulated on social media, but of course it would give a contradictory message to the one that was more frequently broadcast. And not only was there a lot of social media work done before the July 11th actions, but afterwards, there was a lot of broadcasting of it, and particularly some of the relatively large crowds that took place, but none of the crowds were as large as the one that's pictured here. Let's move to the next slide. Well, with the relative success, and one has to note that the size and the number of demonstrations that took place on July 11 is an important mark that not only the U.S. policy and projects were effective, but that there was discontent among Cubans who joined in the demonstrations, and the number of them in different cities, and the relative size of them was something that Cuba had not witnessed since the 1990s. Based on that perceived success, a number of groups that had been involved in organizing for July 11 started to plan for something in October and November. And the media, social media efforts were ramped up. Some actions took place within Cuba to plan and to get ready for this. The Cuban government responded in a way that reduced the potential effectiveness of it. There were some arrests of people who were seen to be leading what were not only potentially violent demonstrations, but also demonstrations being promoted and supported by U.S. government-funded projects. And in addition to that, things were moving in Cuba, and actually the dates were changed. The two activities that were initially thought about, the general strike, seemed to just evaporate as an idea, but the nationwide demonstrations in November were on the agenda and were being promoted very vigorously through some of the same social media platforms, and apparently from the same individuals and groups. And you know, there's some research on who was involved, but again, the San Isidro movement, which has been shown to receive funding from the U.S., a rap group, if you will, all were very active in trying to promote this November, what eventually became November 15th set of actions. They applied for permits to have their so-called peaceful demonstrations, but the various municipal authorities that were asked to approve them denied them, but the individuals and groups that were involved said they were still going to organize these. Next slide, please. But in the end, November 15th was a non-event in terms of protests against government and the revolution. There was much more evidence. There was evidence, though, of groups that came out to in support of the government and the revolution, including this group pictured in the bottom right photo, called the Red Scarves, or Pañuelos Rojos, who organized a 48-hour party, if you will, in support of the revolution, with music and dancing and well, food, obviously. And the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, joined them on one day and participated joined them in singing some of the songs that were being performed. So that happened on November 15th, but the anti-government, anti-revolution protests did not occur. And clearly the actions by the Cuban government to not approve the permits, the arrests of some people made a difference. But as some people who were there on that day found out that there were other reasons why the actions didn't take place. Even some of the people who participated in July 11th, because they were not happy with the current situation in Cuba, particularly the economic aspects of that and health-related aspects that were under duress, said they didn't come out because they weren't convinced this was the appropriate action, and also because, as it turned out, November 15th was an important day in 2021 for Cuba. It was the first day that the groups of tourism or exchange groups could travel to Cuba. In a sense, Cuba's borders were opened up after they had basically gotten control over the pandemic because of their vaccines and other medical efforts. But also it was the first day that schools were going to open, and people said, that's what we want to recognize on November 15th, not joining in protests, which last time became violent. So last slide. Next one, please. So what I've tried to demonstrate is that both the economic war and, to some extent, the media war have had an impact on Cuba. It's certainly, particularly the economic war, the unilateral coercive measures have undermined the daily life of Cubans, and they continue to do so. But up till now, and November 15th is perhaps a good example of the media war not always being successful. Up till now, those effects have not led to what is sometimes referred to as regime change in Cuba. But for me, it's important to note how much US government resources, that is my and other people's tax dollars, have been devoted to this effort to bring about change, to intervene in a country that's whose sovereignty we should, I think, should be respecting. But how much money has been used for this, much of which has had a negative effect on the daily lives of Cuban people. And I don't think that's something that the US population or the US government should be proud of. But without effect, the ultimate effect, goal of regime change. But I asked myself, what would be the alternative uses of that? I mean, much like some people, including myself, would say, you know, what would happen if we reduced dramatically the budgets of military budgets in the US and other countries? You know, what could those funds have been used for? The same goes for this economic and media war. Resources, in a sense, are being thrown at these violent actions designed to promote harm on a population, and yet the funds could have been used in the United States, in Cuba, or in the rest of the world to make the place better for people. The funds that were, if you will, wasted on media and economic war against Cuba might have made a difference in the lifespan of people in southern Africa, or might have made a difference in the in combating the hunger that is a serious problem around the world, but instead were used for this politically motivated set of actions. Let me stop at that point to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Mark, por tu conferencia, también por las aportaciones desde las, no solamente sobre fuentes diversas que tú nos has presentado en esta conferencia, sino también por todas las imágenes, ilustraciones y también la forma en que se ha observado este fenómeno desde distintos enfoques. Yo voy a hacer unos comentarios a tu conferencia en español primero y después unas preguntas en inglés, con el fin de continuar la discusión con los otros participantes. También Marco Aurelio Navarro, que nos está acompañando, organizador del evento, también ya ha hecho una pregunta, la misma que leeré junto con las preguntas que yo tengo preparadas. Y bueno, mis comentarios en realidad van en torno a un poco a la reflexión, yo como historiadora, que he podido hacer de tu conferencia y también como pues, especialista en el campo de la educación. Una de las preguntas va a ir dirigida al campo de la educación y otra sobre la historia y estas relaciones entre Estados Unidos y Cuba. Considero que la visión del doctor Mark Ginsburg nos ha hecho una reflexión muy profunda sobre lo que significa actualmente las relaciones Estados Unidos-Cuba. Esta actualización que nos ha hecho y que nos presenta de los más recientes movimientos en una guerra mediática principalmente, pero también una guerra económica que ha trazado Mark por medio de la historia, hace una reflexión profunda de lo que está sucediendo en Cuba, que nosotros hemos tenido muy poco acceso, también en México, a reconocer qué es lo que sucede en Cuba durante la pandemia, ¿no? Durante esta pandemia por COVID-19, que llevamos 2 años que hemos estado encerrados, cada uno de los países con una comunicación mucho más activa y con una relación sin duda mucho más activa con los Estados Unidos que con Cuba. Hemos tenido acceso a mucha más información de la que procede de los Estados Unidos que de la que procede de Cuba. Esta gran imagen, ¿no? que parte de un reconocimiento en primera histórico de las relaciones no solo económicas, sino también diplomáticas, como señaló Mark, entre Cuba y Estados Unidos, dan un resultado que es muy interesante en la actualidad, ¿no? Yo como historiadora podría decirles a ustedes que una de las partes más importantes de la reflexión histórica pues no es quedarnos en qué sucedió en 1959 con la Revolución Cubana, ¿no? Sino saber justamente qué es lo que ha sucedido a partir de este gran evento que fue la Revolución Cubana y que tiene las bases para el desarrollo de un país que sigue buscando su propio desarrollo con un proyecto propio, que es pues un proyecto socialista. Esta primera introducción, yo nada más pondría, ¿no?, como dos puntos que valdría la pena. La primera es, José Martí en el siglo XIX había reflexionado sobre la importancia de conocer a nuestra América, ¿no? Esta reflexión es profunda y creo que viene desde ya pues previo a la independencia de Cuba, que Cuba fue el último país en independizarse de nuestra América, no de las Américas como en Estados Unidos lo llaman, sino de nuestra América, y justamente fue pues un espacio de debate y sobre todo de mucha guerra entre España y los Estados Unidos, ¿no?, ya como una nación formada en esa época. El imperio español no tuvo más que ceder a sus territorios y bueno, prontamente será Estados Unidos quien tendrá interés en ocupar este espacio. Hasta la fecha pues tenemos esta visión imperialista de los Estados Unidos, ¿no?, de querer tener todavía el poder en una región como es el Caribe. La región del Caribe es estratégica, ¿no? Es estratégica para las relaciones no solo de Estados Unidos, sino también para las de México. Combina el espacio transatlántico, es decir, la relación entre Europa y América, así como que también tiene recursos importantes, recursos humanos y también recursos naturales. Aquí me gustaría hacer, ¿no?, como el hincapié de que justamente es en el siglo XIX, finales del siglo XIX, principios del XX, cuando los Estados Unidos empieza a conformarse como una hegemonía a nivel mundial, y una de las reflexiones que hace muy profunda Mark en esta conferencia, y de hecho es con lo que introduce su conferencia, es sobre la paz, ¿no?, la reflexión que tiene la paz. Y a mí me parece que esta es la reflexión más importante en el texto de Mark, sobre todo porque en los Estados Unidos la paz es un elemento importante para el desarrollo de sus libertades, ¿no? Es una condición importante para el desarrollo de la democracia. Y sin la paz, en Estados Unidos consideran que no hay posibilidad de desarrollar ni el sistema en este momento capitalista, ni este liberalismo político del cual se ha sustentado Estados Unidos desde sus orígenes. La discusión es interesante. Mark hace una reflexión importante de que esta paz en realidad no es, pues no es que sea real, ¿no? O sea, en realidad es una ficción que se ejerce por otras formas de violencia, ¿no? Y él obviamente nos va a poner, ¿no?, en esta conferencia, en esta discusión, dos temas que son importantes, ¿no? Uno es la guerra económica, es decir, una guerra que resulta oculta por medio de bloqueos que históricamente pues han marcado la historia de un país como Cuba, y recientemente, aunque, bueno, en formas recientes, aunque no muy novedosas, ¿no?, desde el siglo XIX, Mark está registrando que ya existe esta guerra mediática, es, ¿no?, como otra forma de ejercer violencia sobre una población que ha decidido un sistema distinto a la democracia. Yo aquí estaría, ¿no?, tendría como muchas otras reflexiones que hacer a la ponencia de Mark. Me gustaría ya nada más cerrar con dos reflexiones finales, ¿no? Tenemos ahorita un mundo convulso, complejo, ¿no? La geopolítica que ha generado la COVID o la pandemia por COVID-19 ha generado pues una fuerte reestructuración del mundo, ¿no? No solo de una manera económica, sino también social y política, en la cual América pues está básicamente también en una disputa importante. Actualmente tenemos una discusión muy importante sobre la Cumbre de las Américas, quién es el que debe de ser invitado y qué gobiernos debe reconocer Estados Unidos. Por el momento no ha reconocido el gobierno de Venezuela ni ha reconocido el gobierno de Nicaragua. Esto significa mucho también para la organización de nuestra propia América. Invitó a Cuba, ¿no? Como un reconocimiento especial, pero esto continúa, ¿no? Sigue siendo indicadores importantes de lo que no está considerando Estados Unidos como parte de su, pues de su propio dominio, de su propia parte imperial, ¿no? O sea, lo que no puede él dominar todavía. Me parece aquí la última reflexión es algo que puso en la mesa también Marc, un poco para generarles a ustedes más reflexiones en sus preguntas que estarán haciendo por el chat de YouTube para darles algún tiempo todavía para reflexionar más. Es sobre esta cuestión social, ¿no? Y yo creo que la parte más importante es que si bien los Estados Unidos en estas guerras mediáticas, por medio de, bueno, estos movimientos independientes mediáticos, ha buscado generar una protesta social, esta protesta social realmente no ha sido ejercida o no ha sido verdadera en Cuba, ¿no? En la realidad cubana, ¿no? Estamos viendo que estos movimientos que nos presentas tú, tanto del 11 de julio como del 15 de noviembre, son movimientos que no han sido creados con una base social, digamos, ¿no? Como fue la Revolución Cubana propiamente, que fue un movimiento social. Esto también lo vemos en otros fenómenos como ha sido en México, ¿no? También ha habido este tipo de tratar de movilizar cuestiones políticas en México, ¿no? Con este mismo esquema, que no sé si procede igualmente de los Estados Unidos, pero que posiblemente, tratando, ¿no? Como de hacer un levantamiento en contra de los gobiernos y con sentimientos antinacionalistas. En el caso de los Estados Unidos, sobre Cuba, antirrevolucionarios, ¿no? La revolución es un sentimiento que va en contra de la paz, ¿no? Con esto yo cerraría, ¿no? Esta paz que promete la democracia va en contra de, ¿no? La revolución, y sobre todo la revolución socialista, va en contra de toda esta movilización, ¿no? Desde las estructuras y el pensamiento marxista, inclusive, para decirlo como debe de ser, ¿no? Yo aquí, pues haría, ¿no? Como que la reflexión tiene que ver mucho con nuestro país también, ¿no? Con procesos que hemos visto en la pandemia muy similares también a lo que viene, ¿no? En este contexto después de la pandemia, que claro que hay oportunidad y muchos grupos políticos ven la oportunidad para transformar algunos sistemas de los cuales no están de acuerdo, como en el caso de los Estados Unidos, en contra del régimen comunista. Yo aquí daría pues la palabra a las preguntas, que ya tenemos algunas preguntas en el foro. Haría dos preguntas básicamente a Marc, ¿no? En inglés, un poco para que él pueda, y también seguir con la lectura de las dos preguntas que tenemos en el foro desde YouTube. Con el fin de que Marc tenga otro tiempo para reflexionar con nosotros. Antes, pues agradecerle todo esto sobre todo de actualizarnos, ¿no? En la realidad cubana, que es a veces muy difícil comprenderla, ¿no? Desde nuestras realidades latinoamericanas, que pues también percibimos este bloqueo. La primera pregunta desde mi perspectiva sería, what is the importance of these US and Cuban relations on the education, and if you study in your programs the relations, and what is the approach? What kind of approach do you give to these historical and also contemporary issues about studies on US and Cuban relations? The second one is what...
Can I respond to that one and then we'll do the next?
Yeah, if you want, we can do it one by one. Okay. And then I can translate and then continue with the other one.
Okay.
So, la pregunta es cuáles son las relaciones entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos, y sobre todo qué tipo de educación o qué tipo de modelo para entender estas relaciones entre los Estados Unidos y Cuba se produce desde los Estados Unidos? Esa es la primera pregunta. Go.
Thank you for the question, but also, Paula, for the excellent summary. I wish my abstract had been as well developed as your synthesis of the presentation. This is a very relevant question, an important question, and I guess I should have spoken to the issue of how this paper and this topic connects to the field of comparative education, or to education more specifically. I mean, certainly, in the longer paper, I identify some of the specific impacts on education that the blockade has produced, in terms of the cost of acquiring basic materials that are used in classrooms, from pencils to paper to let alone computers and other things that are much more expensive because they can't be sourced from the closest country, but also can't be sourced from some other countries where the manufacture of those products, computers being a good example, are at least 10% using components made in the US. So Cuba education system suffers. That's its healthcare system and other aspects of daily life, including food, because of the blockade. But the other way in which, to me, this is relevant to education, it's not about how schooling is organized or what the curriculum is, but to me, the media war, the messages conveyed through the media, is part of an education project. It's extra school, if you will. Perhaps, with regard to social media, may even be more powerful than the messages that teachers give during their lessons. The newspapers and television programs, both funded by the US directly and so-called independent ones, are trying to educate not just the Cuban people, but also those of us who live in what some people call the belly of the beast, about why we should hate Cuba or not like Cuba, and why we should go along with US policies. But as I said, even that message hasn't been effective on the majority of people. But it's very clear that the messages through the media are quite powerful, even among our academic scholarly colleagues. I just returned from Cuba, as I mentioned, but in addition to going to May Day, I went to a conference in Guantanamo, which was about peace and the abolition of foreign military bases, not just in Guantanamo, but all around the world. And I was sharing this with some colleagues at the University of Maryland, and one of them said, how did you go to Guantanamo? I thought it's a military base and a prison. I said, well, just to clarify, Guantanamo is a province in Cuba, part of which is occupied by the military base and the prison. But there's a capital of the province, which I visited, in a town near the base. But the idea that Guantanamo was only a military base, this is a colleague who's not a Cuban specialist, but he's pretty well read, particularly in the mass media. I should just add, in clarifying the response about the role of the corporate media, I don't think every article that's been written about in a negative way about Cuba was paid for by the US government. I think there's also an alignment ideologically between some of the political and economic elites, those who own or manage the corporate media, and the U.S. government. So some of it is a result of what I would see as the more general problem with mass media, at least in the U.S., the narrow ownership and the narrow ideological perspective. So in a way, you didn't have to pay people because the editors might have only approved certain kinds of articles, or the managers may have only promoted certain kind of conversations about it. And again, I just want to emphasize the significant, potentially significant impact of the various kinds of media I discussed on the way people understand Cuba, including some Cubans. I mean, they obviously have the alternative reality that they experience on a daily life, some of which matches what is said in the messages, and some of which doesn't. This is, I think, particularly a challenge for the generations that were born after 1959. The people in my generation, if you will, had experience with Cuba before the revolution. And they also had experiences during other challenging times in Cuba. But those who are, like the individuals I spoke to in the town in Artemisa, they only know the, if you will, post-special period, the post-90s period. As they said to me at one point, "Oh yeah, you're from that other century, aren't you?" I was born in the 20th century and spent, more than half of my life in that century. And, for them, that century is just something they learned about in the history books. There was another question, Paula.
Yeah,
or do you want to translate that first?
Yeah, I can translate
Or
first.
just summarize, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, Mark nos ha hecho la pregunta a la que hice referencia, Mark, ¿no? Básicamente dice que sí, para hacer esta conferencia, y sobre todo porque el tema que nos está ocupando actualmente es en este congreso es la educación y la teoría comparativa. Él sí hizo varias reflexiones sobre el impacto que ha tenido esta guerra mediática y esta guerra económica en Cuba, sobre todo en el campo de la educación, ¿no? Entonces, el costo sobre todo de estas, pues de esta guerra mediática, pues ha sido alto para Cuba, sobre todo en el problema de la pandemia. Eso es lo que menciona Mark, ¿no? Sobre todo por el alza de algunos materiales. Él cita, por ejemplo, el precio, ¿no? Y comprar mucho más caros, no solo durante la pandemia, sino también como un efecto de este bloqueo que ha sido pues continuo desde la llegada de la Revolución Cubana. El alto costo, por ejemplo, hasta de los lápices, ¿no? O sea, él menciona que esto pues ha generado problemas en el sistema educativo de Cuba, ¿no? El poder también tener acceso a computadoras también resulta sumamente caro para el sistema educativo cubano, y también el renovar su propio currículum y poder actualizar algunas de las, sobre todo, pues algunas necesidades que tiene el sistema educativo de Cuba. Aquí yo, ¿no? Como que yo podría considerar que una de las cosas más importantes, dentro de los sistemas educativos es pues, justamente, ¿no? Tener una infraestructura lo suficientemente o mínimamente lo suficiente para que se pueda desarrollar. En el caso de Cuba, pues las necesidades son desde las más primarias, ¿no? Como nos lo puede aquí reseñar Mark. La segunda parte de lo que él, ¿no? Como que y fue una segunda parte, cómo se enseña esta educación sobre Cuba en los Estados Unidos, dice que el impacto, ¿no?, de esta guerra mediática en los Estados Unidos ha sido y ha tenido mucho más influencia en la gente que lo que ha sido y lo que pueden aportar los académicos, ¿no? Esta forma de por qué, ¿no? Y él menciona, ¿no?, que la cuestión es importante de cómo, ¿no? Cómo hacer pensar que no nos guste Cuba, ¿no? Y también el odiar, ¿no?, este sistema o régimen cubano, pues ha sido algo constante y permanente, ¿no? Y es una información que reciben constantemente los estadounidenses en esta guerra también mediática en contra de los sistemas en contra del sistema socialista de Cuba. También menciona, ¿no?, una tercera cosa que yo creo que aquí es importante, ¿no?, que los mensajes que se dan en esta guerra mediática son mensajes con mucha potencia a nivel mediático, obviamente no a nivel académico, es decir, pues no tiene esta calidad de información, pero sí tiene un impacto importante. Él menciona una experiencia, una anécdota de cuando fue o pudo asistir a una reunión en Guantánamo y uno de sus colegas le preguntó que por qué iba a Guantánamo como una base militar de los Estados Unidos, y él le recordó que esta no era una base militar de los Estados Unidos, sino que es un territorio ocupado por los Estados Unidos, que ahí la información pues cambia completamente, ¿no? O la forma de entender esta ocupación de los Estados Unidos en algunos territorios de Cuba. La última aclaración que hace el autor, sobre todo de su paper o de su conferencia, que a mí me parece muy rica, ¿no?, esta última aclaración, es sobre, ¿no?, la forma en la que esta información de los medios independientes no toda ha sido pagada por los estados o por el gobierno, más bien el gobierno directamente de los Estados Unidos, sino que también hay un interés de otros grupos, ¿no?, otros actores, si queremos, actores sociales y políticos, como pueden ser los medios de comunicación masivos, ¿no?, como Fox News posiblemente, no sé, pues yo lo pondré de ejemplo, u otros corporativos que tienen intereses muy específicos, mucho más allá de solo los políticos que tiene la relación diplomática de Cuba a Estados Unidos, y que a mí me parece que es interesante, ¿no?, porque también aquí hay, actores que tienen también intereses mucho más allá de solo contener una revolución cubana, que también son intereses económicos desde mi perspectiva, ¿no?, eso yo lo agregaría, y que me parece que esta es una nota que agrega mucho a la ponencia de Mark. En esta cuestión, ¿no?, nada se hace una última mención es de cómo distintas generaciones entienden, ¿no? Y yo aquí esta sería mi pregunta, pero yo quisiera, y yo creo que ya la contestó Mark, porque esa era mi pregunta, de la acción de los jóvenes millennials, ¿no? O sea, como entender a una nueva generación, que somos nosotros o los más jóvenes todavía del siglo XXI, ¿no?, que están entendiendo y tienen una relación distinta con las redes sociales y sobre todo con el entendimiento de lo que son los sistemas socialistas, ¿no?, en una guerra fría que ya no vivieron, ¿no? Ellos ya no vivieron la guerra fría. Pero yo aquí más bien continuaría con la pregunta de Marco Aurelio, que creo que tiene, ¿no?, pues tiene mucho que ver con esta última reflexión que tú hiciste sobre los grupos políticos de los Estados Unidos, Mark. Entonces, the question is, if you see any difference between US conservatives and Democrats towards Cuba. It's the question of Marco. So if you want to, I think that you have enough material to give us again. So thank you so much, Marco, and I read the other one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Marcos, good question. Some of my fellow activists say the only difference between Democratic Party and Republican Party with regard to Cuba, at least, is the name of the party. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement, but it's important to say that the the blockade was put into place, more than 60 years ago. There have been numerous Democratic Party administrations and Republican Party administrations during that period, which have more or less continued in the war, the economic war. Same with the media war. I mean, the instantiation of the blockade in the 90s was signed off on by President Clinton, a center-left, maybe part of the Democratic Party. The Trump administration, I don't know if the new Republican Party, continued those efforts. So in some ways, there's not much difference. But we have to remember it was a Democratic administration of Jimmy Carter that came close to moving toward more normal relations with Cuba in the 70s. And while some people working for projects that had been funded previously actually undermined it, and that didn't go forward. We have to state that another Democratic administration, Barack Obama, came up with a new strategy for combating Cuba and trying to bring about regime change. I mean, it was quite explicit, but that would open up diplomatic relations and some other things. The current administration of Biden is quite interesting. It was only recently that he took any actions that signaled he might be different than Trump. And these are important, but when there are 243 measures, to have 3 measures that are changed, one has to applaud that and send encouragement to keep going. But at the same time, as has been mentioned, the Biden administration is promoting this Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles in early June, the 6th through the 10th, and it's a Summit of the Americas to focus on promoting democracy. And one aspect of the assumption behind that is that certain countries should not be able to participate, in addition to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And so you can sort of see a pattern about what democracy means according to the U.S. government. Fortunately, the president of Mexico and the presidents of a number of Caribbean countries, Bolivia and others, have spoken out critically of the U.S. decision to do it, but I don't see that being reversed. I find it particularly ironic that an administration that has spent a lot of its media resources blasting the Republican Party for its efforts to limit participation in elections in some of the states, particularly among people of color, and some of the new districting and laws that make it harder for people to register and to vote. Challenging the Republican Party to be more, in line with democratic ideals, at the same time opting on an international level to exclude certain countries from participation in a summit on the Americas. Why should why should anybody, let alone the U.S. government leadership, be consistent in its rhetoric?
So thank you. We have another one, so I can give the two questions at the end in Spanish. So the other one is, what kind of conditions, or what are the fundamental conditions to the resistance of Cuba against this war, mediatic war? So is the last question, and this is another one about Russian-Ukrainian war, but I don't know if we have enough time because we have until 12, so I can just translate two more questions. So that one is open to, well, for the next reflections. So thank you so much, Mark. So I will finish the panel at 12, so we have like just 2 minutes to your last question. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll briefly respond to it. It's very, very significant, and it's obviously one that a lot of Cubans are thinking about. But I must admit that some people in the administration and some of the organizations that they fund are also thinking about it, because if they understand that, they might be able to penetrate and to counter it. And Cubans I've spoken to, and I've also heard leadership speak to this issue, is that the current situation is very hard. I mean, it's some would argue it's more difficult than the 90s, a special period when the economy really went into crisis because its major trading partner, the Soviet Union, let alone the Eastern European Comecon group, disappeared as trading partners. But part of the effort is to actually address people's concerns. I know there have been for the last several years projects going on in communities to address the living conditions of a lot of people. They're also trying to deal with the impact of climate change, and some people recognize that as internationally leading in that area. But also, the fact that Cuba produced and has been using 3 vaccines to combat the virus, and that was a big part of what not only affected Cubans but affected their one of their major sources of foreign currency, that is tourism. So trying to deal with these, but I don't know, to me the most impressive answer to that was the highly educated youth who a few of whom I spoke to, and over the years I've spoken to, who, despite being too young to have experienced the pre-revolutionary period, are knowledgeable about what the revolution has produced, and are also aware of, if you will, the enemy that is promoting the economic and media war against their country. That doesn't mean they don't like Americans. In fact, my Cuban friends and colleagues always say there's a difference between your government and you and the rest of most of the rest of the population. But it does mean that they are critical consumers of all of this social media. So let me leave it at that. But again, to thank the organizers of the conference and Paula for the really helpful coordination and translation.
So thank you so much to everyone. So I just give solo doy la.
I'm sorry.
Dime, ya terminamos la mesa y Carlos, o doy las respuestas brevemente, como tú prefieras.
Bien. Ok, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Mark, por la magnífica presentación que nos has hecho. Muchas gracias, Paola, también por la traducción y por el apoyo que siempre nos brindan Ashley y Deyanara. Y también muchas gracias al auditorio por haber estado presentes aquí en esta importante charla y a todos quienes participaron con preguntas. Hubo, si se dieron cuenta, fue mucho de contexto económico y la guerra mediática y poco de educación, nada más en la respuesta a un encuentro sobre educación. Pero yo voy a aprovechar un minuto para hacerle propaganda a Mark y de pasadita también a mí mismo. Podemos ponerla esta. En este libro, Política Educativa en América Latina, Reforma, Resistencia y Persistencia, que publicó Siglo XXI a finales de 2020 y que yo compilé, en el capítulo 9, Mark y
Roberto.
Humberto García Batista, en el capítulo 9 es Educación y formación de profesores en Cuba, revolución y perfeccionamiento, por Mark Ginsburg y Gilberto García Batista. Es un artículo amplio que habla de la historia de la educación y del previo y el contexto, pero enfocado en el papel de los profesores. Se lo recomiendo, nos ilustra mucho sobre la situación de la educación en Cuba. Y con esto cerramos la exposición. Y le agradezco de nuevo a Mark, que le pido autorización para en el libro que pensamos compilar de esta conferencia, si lo podemos incorporar. Lo entendió, o sea, no hay que traducirlo. Y en 3 minutos más vamos a dar comienzo a nuestro quinto panel de expertos. Muchas gracias, muy amable y hasta luego.